I'd like to introduce Kerry Graham. Once again, her bio is in the book. She has in her bio the statement, her purpose is to evolve the way social change happens in Australia. Please welcome Kerry Graham.
Thanks, Andrew. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the session after lunch. My name's Kerry, as Andrew said, and I couldn't have asked for a better setup in terms of everything that's happened up until today in the conference to share the content I've been asked to share. Who's heard about this framework called collective impact? Great, that's at least 5 times as many as read the National Mental Health Report. So if I think through today, we started with an Indigenous welcome to country. And I too acknowledge that we gather on the land of the traditional custodians, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and future. But we then heard from Zach, Alida and Kathy about what happens when systems work well. Sometimes that change took a while, but all of them could speak about what happens when systems work well. And then Frank talked about when one part of the system has an enormous amount of change happening in it, and in his case, or what he was sharing with us, was the change happening in government. And Anne then spoke about how does another part of the system, being the service system or those in practice, how do they instigate change in their part of the system? So hopefully what I'm going to do to keep us all engaged after lunch is how that all weaves together. How does the whole system actually seek to change together to create the change we all desire? And I can't talk about that without sharing with you just for a brief minute why I'm so interested in that. So I describe myself as a lapsed lawyer, a bit like being a lapsed Catholic. So I believe that making change in the lives of supporting change in the lives of young people was best. I could best serve that by being an advocate, so I became a children's specialist. I worked for Aboriginal Legal Services. And I spent a long time working in the court system in New South Wales and the Northern Territory. And what I learned is once I became a competent lawyer, I was practically a tour guide in that system. That by the time I met a young person when they first arrived at court, I could predict with pretty high accuracy what their result would be. And actually the things that kept them awake at night was not their legal matters. And I thought that was an inherently flawed system. So I left and retrained in social work and became a drug and alcohol outreach worker in Redfern. And it was about the time where Sydney was full of heroin. It was pretty awash with heroin. And they declared it a crisis, and there was a huge political conference called the Drug Summit. And out of that came the first drug and alcohol court in Australia. So I came back into the law to set up that court. And I wish I knew then what I now know around systems change, because what that was taking a system that was designed to be punitive and a deterrent for young people and actually forcing it to be therapeutic. And what it took in terms of political will and a whole group of people who were prepared to break rules and step outside the status quo to create that change. I left the drug court after 4 years and became very passionate about young people's mental health and wellbeing as the place where I thought I should put my focus. And I became, over time, the CEO of Inspire Foundation, which you guys would all know because of reachout.com. Australia's largest youth mental health service. In fact, we had a strategy that by 2012, 1.5 million young people would access our service in 1 year, and we hit that target. That's 1 in 2 young people. If you type help into Google, you get reach out. And what I thought was, wow, we are really relevant. We work hard at being really relevant to young people, engaging them where they choose to seek help, which is online. So what if it's great if we can meet their needs, if an online service 24/7 can meet their needs, but what if we can't? What if we're this gateway service and when they come to our gate and we open our gate, we can't then open all the gates they need? So turning into the youth mental health system and trying to work out how do you get a system to align behind young people's needs? How does a small non-profit that's a national online service affect the practice and behaviour of a hospital? Or affect the practice and behaviour of a GP? I mean, it just became so incredibly complex and difficult. And I did see in the time that I was at Inspire significant change where with this otherwise highly fragmented and competitive and very siloed youth mental health system actually could come together. But it was often around political opportunity, like the federal inquiry, the Senate inquiry into youth suicide, where about 400 organisations put in one submission saying this is what we need for youth mental health in this country, instead of 400 and whatever different ones. But all of this made me incredibly curious about how do you get large systems that have legacies that keep them often completely separated from each other. How do you start getting them to work together to achieve the outcomes? And the thing that drives me is what young people need when they're seeking help. So I left being a CEO and just started looking internationally around systems change, and I discovered collective impact, and I've become very passionate about it ever since. So I want to share with you what is that framework and go a little bit deeper than what you can read and work out, is it worth all the buzz that it's currently attracting? So that's about me, but let me just take a minute to learn a bit about you. Who's from a service provider in the room? Okay, who's from government? Oh, so let's do who's from local government. Who's from state government? Federal? You always put your hand up 10 till you feds. So it was about 4 or 5 from state, 1 from federal. Who gives money into this community? Who's a philanthropist? Any money, anywhere, locally, into their own community. I imagine most of you do. Who's a business owner? 3 or 4. Who doesn't have a formal leadership role? They don't work for a service or a government or... Fantastic. Okay, that's at least 20. That's fantastic. All right, so collective impact is relevant to each of you because what collective impact's trying to do is harness the leadership, informal and informal, inside a community, however community defines itself, and actually align that to a stated purpose for change. Now, Anne couldn't have set this up better because the place for us to start with for collective impact is around these really curly social problems, wicked problems, adaptive problems, complex problems. So I'm going to start by taking us through 2 frameworks around what are complex problems, because the premise is before you move to a solution, before you even know is collective impact what I should be considering, first understand the problem you're trying to solve before you move to solution. So collective impact is reserved only for complex problems. So you would have a complex problem if you've got contradictory knowledge. So what we're talking about here is put a problem in the middle of the room. Let's bring the one that I just introduced. Young people accessing services from online to offline and having a highly responsive system that meets their needs. Put that in the middle of the room. And your experience of that problem or that opportunity will be very different from yours. And if someone who put their hand up from federal government, it'll be different from the perspective of state government and different again if you're a mum or dad. The thing about complex problems is that everyone's experience of it is absolutely right and often different. So often when we're trying to work around what solution gets prioritised, we're actually trying to compete on what our experience of the problem is. And we need to solve it this way because my experience says this. When actually a complex problem says everyone's experience is right, but it will be different. Therefore, you're working in systems or contexts that have conflict, differences of opinion, differences of perspective. Lots of people involved, lots of different opinions. They're often described in their economic burden. And what all of you would know very well is that you can't easily ring-fence a complex problem and say, here's its clear boundary. Because if you're talking about a highly responsive youth mental health system, you're talking about a drug and alcohol system as well. You're talking about family support. You're talking about peers. You know, it's all interconnected. Here's a helpful checklist to know if you've got a complex social problem or not. They're difficult to frame, there's no one storyline. The cause and effect relationship is sometimes unclear, and we'll spend a bit of time on that. Lots of stakeholders, lots of different unique experiences. They change all the time. They don't stand still. There's no obvious right or wrong, and there's certainly no one set of solutions. And often they're hard to define in terms of success. By the way, for those that learn by writing, please write, but you'll get all these slides as well. Right, so I'm going to talk through this framework, and if it's useful, some people when they see this framework have the light bulb that Anne mentioned, so I've included the link at the bottom so you can show the video of the guy that wrote this framework, Dave Snowden, to play to your teams or your organisation. But this is a framework that just says, first understand the type of problem you're dealing with before you move to solution. We're going to whiz through it. The first type of problem is a simple one. Now the analogy here is baking a cake. If you put all the ingredients together, you put it in an oven at the right temperature, and you don't even have to be a good cook, but it's fairly predictable what's going to come out. Cause and effect are quite close together. Problem, intervention, fairly predictable solution, fairly predictable outcome. This type of problem warrants best practice, something that we know from evidence has worked and will work again when replicated. If we move up to a complicated problem, this is when cause and effect are starting to get much further apart. And the analogy here is putting a man on the moon. You need a lot of technical capability, you've got to sequence a lot of things one after the other, you need a lot of expert support. But if you do it, there is one solution at the end and you can do it again. So, good practice is what you need here, and technical support. When we move over to this side, a complex problem, there's no relationship between cause and effect. The only way you ever see a pattern is in hindsight. So when you put an intervention into the system, the language here is desired consequences and unintended consequences. The analogy is raising a child. Who here has 2 or more children? Who raises their first child in exactly the same way they raise their second child? Who has a strategic plan for their child? It's constantly testing and trying. What works with your first child is and it works for a period of time, is you test and try, and what works you do more of, and what doesn't work you stop doing. And when your second child, you have probably a different set of ways of interacting or strategies that you use, and they only work for a time. That's a very good analogy for a complex problem. Over this side is chaotic, often in response to a crisis where we go back into command and control models, and what you're doing here is seeking to stabilise before you innovate. It's the bit in the middle that interests me the most, and the hypothesis here is, as people involved in social change, passionate about making change in their communities, actually this is where we spend most of our time, because at any one time we're not sure what we're responding to. Is it a simple, complicated, complex, or sometimes chaotic problem, and it could be in any one day? So, when we look at what are the most appropriate responses for the type of problem you've got, if you've got a simple problem where it's highly predictable if you do an intervention, what it's going to be, the most appropriate response is coordination. Coordinate the best practice you have in your community, and you'll get a very predictable response. When we get up to good, complicated problems where you need lots of technical experts sequencing and experimenting about what the solution would be, you need cooperation. But you only need collaboration for complex social problems. And collaboration is when you convene the entire system. Because when we put a complex problem in the middle of the room, you need everyone's different perspectives to get a full understanding of that problem. So collaboration's only warranted for a complex problem. Now the problem is, include myself in this, most of us who have done training around social change are trained on this side. I'm a lawyer that then did social work, highly technical training. So the concept that we've had introduced into the room this morning is that in order to address complex problems, you've got to unlearn some of the stuff we've learned as an individual and as a system. Best practice is not the most responsive approach for complex social problems. And policymakers, in the interest of reducing risk, prescribe best practice in places where it shouldn't be prescribed. Best practice kills innovation. By its very nature, you do it and it's predictable what you're going to get. There is no innovation. So, if we want to address complex social problems as individuals and as a system, we're obligated to learn how to collaborate. And there's nowhere you go to learn how to collaborate. There's no collaboration 101. The only way to learn how to collaborate is by doing it. All right, that was framework number 1. This is another framework, and some people like this one better, but they're both the same message. This axis here across the bottom is certainty. So here, I don't know how easy it is to read, but this one is when you're very close to certainty, you know what it is you should be doing, and this end is far from certainty. It's very unclear what should happen. On the other axis is close to agreement. Everyone agrees, but at the top, very low agreement. So let's look at the types of problems. If we have a simple problem, we're baking cakes, we know the recipe and everyone wants a cake. So it's down this end, and the most appropriate response is follow the recipe, because we know what to do and everyone agrees it should be done. The best example here is immunisation. You want it to look the same all over the country. 99.9% of people agree it should happen, and you want a fully immunised population. If we go up this end of the spectrum, when you've got putting a man on the moon, a complicated problem, you've got agreement on what needs to happen, but you actually don't know what it is that needs to happen. So this response here is use expertise, bring in all the technical experts you can, experiment and build the knowledge base, because there will be a solution that emerges. This one's an interesting one, where we know what needs to happen, but we do not agree. So a great example here is a methadone clinic or a safe injecting room. We all know what they do and what they don't do, but can we get them in it? Can we get people to agree where they should be? So if it's a political problem, you've got to develop common ground, you've got to try and build consensus, or you've got to go ahead knowing that you don't have everyone on board. When we go out this end to chaotic, this is where we talked about you seeking to stabilise. You open up all the communication lines you can, and you seek to innovate to prevent the chaos from happening again. But it's the bit in the middle, the wicked and complex problems, the analogy of raising a child. This is where the most appropriate response is to learn by doing and see what happens, this adaptive emergent response, which is the essence of collaborating together. All right. So I'm purposely spending a bit of time on saying you would only collaborate when you've got a complex problem. So let's understand it before we move to a collaborative response. Collaboration is long-term and challenging work. You would not do it if you didn't have to. So the other way of pointing that is this: if you can solve a social problem or any problem alone, you should, because it's quicker and it's probably cheaper and quicker. But if you cannot solve it alone, like many of the problems I think that brought you into this room or attracted you to PIR, then you should be considering collaborating and therefore learning how to do it well. Last one, and then we'll jump into collective impact. All these words represent a continuum for moving up towards collective impact. So at this end is an end we all know well because it's part of our day-to-day, which is where the way we work together, the way we engage with each other is competition. We're fighting for market share, turf, funding. When we move up the continuum, we're coexisting. I'm aware of you, you're aware of me, but it's not as though we're seeking to do anything about that other than be aware of each other. When we move up to communicate, this is the language of interagency, where I turn up in forums to share with you what I'm doing and you do the same with me, and I'm interested, but I'm not seeking to adapt or change what I do because of what you do. I'm just information sharing. It's important work. When we get up to cooperate, this is often informal. It's often between workers as opposed to management, where you can see projects. I do this, you do that. Let's align this better. Or if I turn up and provide a service inside your group, or if you're running holiday programs and I'm running holiday programs, it's at a project level and it's about aligning. When we get up to coordinate, it's when we start saying, okay, I'm going to start adjusting what I do because I understand what you do, and we don't want to duplicate, or we want to provide a more integrated, connected system. So this is when we might start sharing resources or sharing workers, and from a service point of view, it might be co-location, no wrong door. And when you get up to collaborate, this is clearly the realm of PIR. Partnerships, where you're aligning to a shared vision for change, but it's still quite project and program based. And it's sort of here at this end of the spectrum that you start to get a fork in the road, where the amount of integration and working together is such that you might actually look to integrate more fully. So completely integrated services, one referral pathway, one assessment form. Not mapped referral pathways and one assessment form. In some cases it might be where organisations merge. And right up at this end of the spectrum is where all of those are not sufficient to create the change you want in ways of working together, and you look to align the work of many. So many that integration's not possible, but you're wanting to align the work of many. That's collective impact. So I'm trying to draw here the distinctions between all the other ways of working together. It's relevant to point out that at this end of the spectrum, the thing everyone's protecting is turf. It's protectionist and at that end of the spectrum, what you're building is trust. And you can only walk up this spectrum if you intentionally build more trust. All right, enough framing. So what is this collective impact framework everyone talks about? Who here's done anything in social work or community development? All right, so you're going to look at this framework and go, is that it? Let me tell you about it. So collective impact, the definition is a commitment of a group of important actors from different sectors to a common agenda for solving a specific social problem. It's worth sharing how they came up with this framework, because this is not an academic framework. This is a practice-based framework. So in North America, US and Canada, there were communities, so places, geographic places, which we know well in our country. We call them postcodes of disadvantage, where significant amount of funding gets invested in those communities year on year, and they have continuously poor population level outcomes. So no population level change despite, say, 2 decades or 3 decades of investment. So in the States and Canada, some of these communities, without any significant change, actually started to turn the curve. Move the needle is the language they use in the States. And this small consulting firm in the States went around and interviewed them all and said, what is it that you're doing? And all they did in publishing Collective Impact was distill the things that they had in common down to 5 things. So they said, if you are a community who is saying enough is enough, these outcomes with all this investment, we've got to do better, then pay attention to these 5 things. That's all the Collective Impact Framework says. Here are the 5 things, and none of this, I think, will surprise you. Common agenda, shared measurement, mutually reinforcing activities, get everyone to slowly align towards the goals, continuous communication, and a backbone organisation. So I'm now going to do a whistle-stop tour through all these 5, and then we can go to some questions and conversation. So, common agenda. picture up here to me is important. It looks like a tree, but it's made up of all these people. The reason I asked you is where you're from is collective impact at its absolute core requires you to convene the system you're trying to shift. And everyone who has influence or power in that system, over that system to change it. Which means it needs a cross-sector engagement. It needs government at the table in all three layers. It needs business, it needs philanthropy, it needs people with lived experience, and it needs service providers. And most commonly when we do collaboration in Australia, it's between government and non-profits. So this is one of the significant shifts. You've got to convene your whole system. And some communities do that in a very intentional way. I've seen communities set up what they call a table of 40, 10 from government, 10 from business and philanthropy, 10 from service delivery, and 10 people with lived experience as their initiating leadership group. So getting balance in the system. Because to get to common agenda, yes, you need your big lighthouse on the hill for change, but that's not sufficient. So I facilitate the National Coalition for Suicide Prevention. It took them 4 meetings to get to, we will halve suicide in Australia in the next 10 years. And they thought, great, we've got common agenda. But it's not enough. It's something to celebrate, but it's not enough. If we go back to a complex problem where we put it in the room and everyone had a different perspective, you've got to invest the time in getting everyone's perspective and experience of what the challenge is, so you build common understanding of the problem you're trying to solve. Because most people come to the collaborative table saying, especially non-profits, I just need more money to do more of what I do. But what we're looking for in collective impact is what can we do together that we could never do alone? It's not looking to scale one part of the system, a government response, a non-profit response, or even for that matter, a community response. It's trying to say, what is it that we can achieve together that we could never do alone? So it takes a lighthouse on the hill, a common understanding of the problem in order to get to a shared understanding of how a collaborative effort can make a difference. Let's dive into a shared understanding. Now this slide is, I know it's unreadable, so I'm going to talk it through, but this is one community's example of a shared measure of how they got to shared approach. I'm going to talk it through. It's important to note this is one of the earliest communities of the ones that they looked at to determine or to produce this framework. It's called Strive in Cincinnati, Ohio. 5 local government areas where they had very poor educational outcomes for their students, and it took them 3 years to get to this. Now, since then, about 85 communities around Canada and America have adopted this approach or made it their own, and growing globally. There are about 190 communities around the globe adopting this shared approach. But the point is that they started up this end. So this is the life course of a child born 0, and it finishes at 15. It mobilised, this initiative mobilised because the head of the university said we're not getting enough students coming from high school into university. So her problem, her isolated impact was, I need more students in my university for my organisational survivorship, and also this is why I exist. So she turns to the higher education system and says, the high school system, I need more students, and engages them. And it took them 3 years of talking and negotiating and understanding to say, if you want to improve that outcome, high schools have to work with primary schools have to work with early learning and care settings, which means you've got to be working with new parents. And they coined the term from cradle to career. And what they did is they work out everything they want to see on that life course. So on the bottom, it's student and family support outcomes, and at the top was academic outcomes. And it meant that they could align their system on this shared approach. Absolutely clear, and everyone agreed to it. By the time they got to this, they had 72 organisations part of setting this shared approach to change. Now, 9 years on, they have more than 300 organisations aligning their resources and effort to achieve that shared approach, including federal government education departments. So they started small, 12 organisations at the table, 72 by the time they got to the shared approach, and then now at scale 9 years later, 300 plus organisations. And it's an example of saying, first understand the problem you're trying to solve, then hatch your shared approach to solving it. All right, that's common agenda. Light on the hill, shared understanding of the problem, shared approach to solving it, or tackling it. Hand in hand with common agenda, of course, is how do you measure success. So once you know what your shared approach is, you can start putting goals and targets around it. So again, let's keep with this example. Strive, set 5 goals. Every child prepared for school, every child supported in and out of school, every child succeeds academically, every student enrolls in college or career training, and every student graduates and enters a career. Every student in 5 local government areas. It's changing a trajectory of a generation. Underneath those 5 goals are 53 measures for success or indicators for change. And they report against them. You don't even need to read this or the detail of it. They put a dashboard report out like this every 6 months. And the point is that we experience data in our social system for accountability. They have shifted the culture for data for learning. So you can see this is school by school. You can see that this school up here is actually doing something really well, Cincinnati Public. So they create learning loops between all these schools. What are they doing in that school that can be transferable or a learning for other schools? And how do they share tools and practice and wisdom? Now, it might look like the next school down's performing badly, but context is everything. That school is more than 60% Latino. So what works in the other schools may not and probably won't work there. But they are in a supported learning loop with other schools to try, and they look outward beyond their community to say, well, what are other Latino communities doing in their schools? So it's this, and this happens every 3 to 6 months, these learning conversations. What are we going to test and try? Remember how we said there's no cause and effect relationship in a complex problem? All you can do is experiment and adapt, put something into the system. If it works, dial it up. If it doesn't, stop it. I used to run a non-profit. We're really bad at stopping what doesn't work. This provides accountability systems that bring data to us to say, what do we need to constantly be adjusting to make sure it meets the needs of our goals or in our communities. All right, let's keep going. Mutually aligning activities is a mouthful to say align all of those organisations to move towards the goals, the effort and resources they have control over, what can they move towards the goals. The reason I put a picture of cats up there is this is often referred to as herding cats, because you can imagine all these organisations have, if you're government, you've got your own accountability lines, policies. If you're non-profits, you've got your boards. If you're local government, you've got elected officials. If you're businesses, you've got a bottom line. Everyone has an external driver. So this is influencing without any mandate, influencing without authority. It's the engagement and the sense of trust, and that we can only achieve this together if we work together. That's what keeps people, it's voluntary engagement in change. Continuous improvement through these data systems, bringing feedback into the system so you can adapt, and experimenting, knowing who in your system has the DNA to experiment and who can try things that others may not have the risk appetite for, and watch it. Does it work? And if it does work, move it out. Let's look at a little example. Again, an educational one, but that's because this initiative has been going a long time. That's why I'm using educational examples. So a quick one. They were mobilising around school readiness, this part of a collective impact initiative. So they had principals and primary school teachers and kindergarten teachers at the table. And they learnt from best practice as a place, that if you want to improve literacy, you want kids entering your school with strong alliteration skills and letter recognition. So best practice tells us that. So they started doing deep dives into their data. This is one working group. And what they learned is that students coming from certain parts of the system had high alliteration rates and others didn't. The local daycare providers had low children from that area had low alliteration rates. So they went and asked them, what's happening in your part of the system, long daycare providers? They said, we can't imagine it here, they said, we never thought of ourselves as being important to academic success. They didn't see themselves, they saw their system as a silo or a part that didn't have an impact on the future or another part. So they reframed that and said, you're central to the success of students. So instead of bringing money to that problem, they found people in the system, other teachers and university professors and the like, who knew about how to lift skills in alliteration, and they brought them to family daycare workers. So they did one-day sessions, pro bono support and training, and then they started building across 5 counties. Then every daycare provider trained, and then they brought them in a community practice. Let's share what works and what doesn't work. Within a year, students who were arriving at school with higher alliterations across the entire community. So a population level change within a year. And they really sold this as an early win. That is one continuous improvement. Imagine if you had many, hundreds of them happening across your system, all aligned to these goals. That's systems change. All right, fourth element is continuous communication. You can imagine keeping all of these players from diverse parts of your community involved and connected to a change process. They need to know what information do they need, packaged when and how. That's the role of continuous communication. Now here's the last element of collective impact, and probably, I think, in a way the most curious, and possibly the thing that distinguishes collective impact from collaboration, is this idea of a backbone organisation. The analogy here is the conductor to the orchestra. So if you were all musicians with deep expertise in an instrument and you played without a conductor, you would sound pretty awful. But if a conductor came into the room, one person, one resource can make an orchestra of hundreds come together and play beautiful music. That is a great analogy because the backbone organisation is very small, few number of people, nimble, and their role is very defined. They're the neutral convener of the system. And they wake up thinking every day about how does this collaboration shift the system to meet the goals for that community or those people. So they have very specific roles. They guide the vision and strategy. They don't set it. They support this alignment of activities. You can imagine if you had 50, 60 organisations, you're working organisation at a time, concurrently, trying to get them to align. What's the continuous improvement activities you're doing? Where are you innovating? What are you learning from the data? So they're setting up this sort of learning and alignment activity. They have the shared measurement system. Package the data up, like those dashboards, and put it out into the community, understand who needs what data, when and how. They build public will. They engage the entire community, knowing that systems change does not happen in services alone. That if you want to address mental health problems, then you need a more open and responsive community. You've got to address stigma. They advance policy where there's policy blockages, and they mobilise funding, ideally not for themselves, but for the work of the collaboration. So here's the rub about a backbone organisation, is that they serve the collaboration. This is not the power centre at all. It's very servant leadership. So when success happens, when needles are turned and you start getting population level improvement year on year, it's the collaboration that gets all the accolades. The backbone organisation is the behind the scenes, orchestrator, organiser, logistics, learning system. They've got this balance of tension between coordinating and leading. I'm not going to talk through this slide. I'm going to leave it in the pack for later, but it shows you breaking out each of those functions as to what a backbone might do. I think it's quite relevant for lapsed PIR funding, like life beyond PIR. How could a backbone emerge out of all of the work that's been done to date? Let's dispel some myths. Backbones don't set the agenda. They don't drive the solutions. The collaborators drive the solutions. They don't receive the funding. The minute a backbone receives funding to disperse into the community, they lose neutrality. The currency or the legitimacy of a backbone is its neutrality. They can't be self-appointed. They're often selected by the community. In Australia, more commonly than in America, what we're seeing is what's been called dispersed backbones, which is some trusted organisations perform some of those functions and others perform. So quite commonly a university is coming in to do the shared measurement data collection, and then you've got an organisation that has the high trust of the community or some people, individuals that perform that facilitator convener role. But this is fundamentally different from business as usual. This is asking for people to intentionally step away from the status quo. Some of the things that Anne was talking about. That the current system will want to perpetuate status quo. So how as a group do you incrementally improve the system away from the status quo into a more responsive, more flexible, more impactful way of working with people? This is my last one. This is often how collective impact initiatives are depicted as to how they stick together. So over here is the backbone organisation, small, nimble. At the beginning it's probably one or two people. They have this executive or leadership table or steering group or table of 40 is sometimes what I just described earlier, this sort of cross-sector full representation. And then as the common agenda and shared measures are set, which usually takes around 18 months, so this stuff takes time, then you start getting work groups. And these work groups are convened not around projects or programs, but around achieving an agreed change. So once you've got your shared measures and your indicators for change, a work group takes accountability for achieving those indicators or that change. And they're often about 10 people and ideally chaired by people from two different parts of the system. So you might have a service provider with someone with lived experience and 5 or 6 other people, and they're accountable for achieving that agreed change, not for delivering a project. And you can see over time that you draw more and more into that, and work groups stay connected to each other through the backbone. All right, this is my last one. So, like any long-term change process, collective impact happens in phases. And the only reason I wanted to draw this slide out is building the common agenda and setting up the backbone happens in the third phase. That all of the things that lead you to that, a deep dialogue with your community and building that shared understanding of what it is that we want to see changed, what everyone's different perspectives of that is, and how do we shift the system to achieve that change. So this is systems change, this is not program delivery. Okay, I think that's, last plug. If you're really interested on this, there's a conference happening in Sydney in July where this is communities who are actually doing this work in Australia teaching other communities. So it's a peer learning conference. That's probably enough from me. Any thoughts or questions?
I actually went to a collective impact presentation that Tascos put on. Were you there?
No.
Did you have heard of it? And one of the things that I came away from it thinking, great, but how are we going to get all these mobs, these diverse mobs, to even come together and give any time? Because it seems to be quite time intensive. We've got lots of wicked problems, no problem finding a wicked problem. But I'm just wondering, at the beginning, when you're talking about in Sydney, for instance, people working on this, what was the thing that really got people together to do that first bit of work?
It's a great question. I'm going to do it in reverse order. We reckon there's 60 communities around Australia currently intentionally trying this framework out. Some are quite advanced, some are right at the beginning. There's probably more in Tassie than anywhere else.
Wow.
We ran a national initiative to incentivise communities to work this way. There's $1 million of prize money or resources up for grabs. We have more applicants in Tasmania than anywhere else, and the community that won that was Birdie. So it's not and this is more relevant, I think, for communities away from capital cities. So, in answer to your first question, I reckon there's 3 storylines for collective impact. The first one's urgency, which is people banging the table and people from different parts of your system banging the table saying, these outcomes are no longer acceptable. And if we keep working the way we've always worked, we're just going to get exactly the same. We have to try something different, and therefore let's commit to working together differently. And the more people you can activate in your community who have influence into different parts of your community to become champions and do the table banging, you will generate urgency. Because the last urgency you want is urgency generated by a crisis. So how do you create a crisis? I think we're in a crisis around youth mental health, but if we were in a crisis, we would be responding differently. So we clearly don't think we are, even though we are. So how do you leverage that into creating a sense of crisis? That's the first one. The second narrative is, wow, I have been working in this community for most of my life. I have given so much of myself, and I have seen other leaders do that. And I thought for the effort I gave, I would see more return. I would see more change. And so what I see is leaders like that who have made long-term commitments to their community, gather up the few others who have made long-term commitments and sit down, probably over dinner, and say, I just can't keep going like this. I just think that if we work differently together and better together, there must be better ways we must be able to create more change than what we've seen in our careers or our lifetimes or our experience of being in receipt of service. And that's the language of consensus, the slow burn. There's a third one that I'm seeing, which is the language of self-determination. So Indigenous leaders have taken or adopted or seen in collective impact a way to do business that actually allows, in their mind, community self-determination, because it tries to equalise power by bringing all the sectors together, all the parts of the system together. It tries to equalise power, and that is a constant balance, but it provides a container or something, a process within which the equalisation of power can start to happen. So Indigenous leaders speak the language of self-determination, and I think they are the 3 storylines into collective impact. And the one that works in your community will be about where your community's at.
So can you start if you don't have all the groups?
Start with the willing. You never start with the most resistant. The story that I told mostly in this set of slides, they started with 12. And then as you grow, you attract. There is some sort of narrative about you have to create the cool table. We're used to working this way. I'm not going to turn up to interagencies anymore. We need them, but they don't create change. I'm going to create a new table where we do more than just share information. We're prepared to change what we do now because I now know what you do, and I'm not going to replicate it. I'm not going to duplicate it, and I will fight my funders to get my funding changed so that I do something that's more valuable. And that's the type of table you need to create. There's a question here in the middle.
Will you help us?
Sure, but you don't need me. There are actually now a growing network of, if I don't sound arrogant, people like me, but also other communities. So there are 4 communities in Tassie that convene around working this way and share learnings. Glenorchy, Clarendon Vale, Launceston, and Burnie. And they meet regularly to share practice. But we also convene ways for communities to share practice with each other on Collaborate for Impact, the website. But if you need someone to come and help you think through in the beginning, I can connect you to people. Yes.
One more question.
Do you think that there is a relationship between, you're saying it seems to be happening in smaller communities? Do you think there is a relationship between there maybe you need to look at larger, like capital cities as like 14 small communities or something like that to... Is it a bit more difficult?
Yes and no. So there's an initiative starting in Mount Druitt that's about 9 months in Mount Druitt. And the thing about collective impact is at some point you've got to decide what your boundary line is, what's in and what's out. So in there, they went down to 12 suburbs. Now, how you ring fence 12 suburbs and then change the system just for those 12 is an interesting thought. Because surely if you change the way facts or family and community services in Mount Druitt relates to that community, you're changing facts for the whole region. But they've started with just those 12 suburbs. So having said that, collective impact initiatives have an easier time when they can more easily wrap their hands around the geography, which is why towns are turning to it, and why local government areas are turning to it, because there are sort of, it can be neater, but there's nothing neat about doing this work. So I don't think you should, my sense is if you can mobilise, if you've got urgency or consensus and you can mobilise, work out the geography later, let it come. Because there's no clear boundaries. A health boundary is different to a local government boundary is different to a river line, whatever. So just if you've got mobilisation, work with that.
Thanks very much, Kerry. An inspirational talk. Would you please join me in thanking Kerry?
Thanks very much.
Thanks very much.